I was really pleasantly surprised to be invited to speak on this panel because I don't know anything about tanks, full disclosure. So if there are any sort of military questions, then it will be best directed at other people qualified. But I know a little bit about geopolitics. I'm not going to actually talk too much about geopolitics in my introduction. I'm going to talk more about the West's existential crisis and how that undermines its geopolitical coherence, commitment, and power in a dangerous world. Because the battlefield is not just out there, it's actually in here. The elephant in the room is that if the West is going to defend itself and defend so-called liberal principles, then it's going to have to redirect massive public spending away from domestic things towards defense. This is at a time of stagnation, when hip surgeries are being cancelled because of sewage leaks in hospitals, and at a time when it actually takes longer to get from London to Boston, Lincolnshire by train than it takes to fly from London to Boston into USA. So let's be real here about the trade-offs, because this is about tanks versus trains, artillery versus ICU beds. There is a big problem right now, and that is that the West doesn't know what it stands for, and it doesn't know why that is worth defending. Now, during the Cold War, it was clearer what the West stood for and why it was worth defending. It stood for freedom in the face of oppression. It stood for the organicism of self-regulating free markets in the face of the arrogance of central planning. It stood for the romance of the rugged individual versus the divine collective. And this, of course, is a Disney-ish simplification, and not everyone agreed on the story, to say the least, at the time, but the point is that that didn't really matter. What mattered is that elites believed it, and a decent proportion of the public also believed it. And that helped to justify what were impressive levels of defense spending during the Cold War. And today, I would say that the story of who the West is and why it's worth defending isn't so clear-cut. Somehow, the claim that it stands for freedom does have less power. There is a widespread belief in Western civilization now that it was founded on slavery and it was founded on protectionism rather than liberty. There is also a widespread belief that freedom is actually a soiled ideal, that it represents this kind of reckless, selfish egoism that actually poses a threat to civilization. And I think we saw that discourse really emerge as such crystallize during the pandemic. And other values, such as equality and diversity, actually have more salience. And there isn't the same sense of clarity, I would say, with ideals like equality. There isn't that sense of clarity that these are distinctively Western. So freedom is no longer this kind of uniting principle. And I think that we're losing sight of the fact that freedom is not merely sort of a polemical passion, sort of a fetish on the right, but it's actually a very pragmatic civilizational recipe. It is quite simply the modern West's secret sauce. But in order to make that, once again, a mainstream unifying idea, I think three things need to happen. I'm going to whiz through them because I'm running out of time. But three intellectual tasks. So the first is that freedom lovers need to achieve some collective clarity on where the neoliberal doctrine on freedom went right and where it went wrong. This is partially a task of economics, but in my opinion, this is also a task of putting economics in its place. And it's time to actually challenge the Cold War liberal orthodoxy that economic freedom is the foundation stone of liberty and replace it with the insight that it's actually freedom of thought and freedom of speech. That is the wellspring from which other freedoms flow. And just the example of the Industrial Revolution, that was preceded by an epoch of a radical new culture of hereticism, of inquiry, exploration, experimentation, and questioning of established ideas. And secondly, I think that we also need a project that is going to salvage some of freedom's historical credibility. Now, what the past few years has taught us is that history is a battlefield in the West. And I think that it's time for an equivalent, a response to the New York Times' 1619 project. The latter, of course, it aims to reframe America's history by placing the consequences of slavery at the very center of the American national and, by extension, liberal international narrative. Now, this needs to be countered by a fresh, nuanced understanding of the West's history, which acknowledges that the West's grand narrative has, for the large part, been a stumbling, schizophrenic groping towards freedom. And actually, if you're going to do a graph of tracking freedom over the last 500 years, you would have impressive peaks and you would have quite mortifying troughs. But the bottom line is that there is this undeniable embracing and diffusion of freedom. And we need to find a way to tell that story again. And thirdly, I think we also need a vision of a liberated future, which we can go out and sell to the next generation. I call them the AI generation, because I think that one of the reasons why people find sort of eco-populism so bewitching is that this vibrant, sensorious substitute for futuristic fantasizing that people just aren't connecting with in terms of what is coming out of Silicon Valley. And I think that there needs to be, in particular, a clarity about what kind of AI superpower does the West want to be, and why is it different to the kind of AI superpower that is emerging in China? China, the sort of hyper-safe, hyper-controlled Shangri-La, where you've got cameras that can analyze 100 faces a second, and no criminal can escape, but also no person who disagrees with, the CCP can escape either. And I think one thing that we have to talk about is how AI can actually unleash human creativity and complement human creativity rather than seeing it as an intelligence to replace and survey humankind. And I've got the red card, so I'm going to stop. But I do want to say, I do find myself asking whether, had Putin dared to attempt what he did, would China be planning to be military ready to invade Taiwan by 2027? Did they not smell a kind of ideological decay and a collapsing confidence in the West? That's why I think it's really, really important that we have this urgent kind of mission to try and find this kind of unifying philosophy that we can all actually come together and support, that will give us the strength in order to make the sacrifices that we're going to need to make.
Thank you, Sherelle.